The Democratic Alliance spent the 2000s amalgamating the minority vote in South Africa, which culminated in them winning an outright majority in the Western Cape in 2009. With coloured Indian and white voters solidly in the bag, the DA knew the only way they could grow would be to attract black African voters who had traditionally only been a small portion of the party's electorate, and thus began the 2010s, also known as the DA's decade of appeasement. Young black South Africans like Lindiwe Mazibuko, Phumzile Van Dam, and Musi Mamani were parachuted into leadership positions, and several ANC-like policies were adopted. At first, the strategy appeared to be working, with the DA increasing their share of the vote in the 2011, 2014, and 2016 elections. This growth was largely due to numerous corruption allegations against then-President Jacob Zuma, which saw some moderate members leaving the ANC, and the DA, being the second biggest party in the country, was seen as the only viable alternative. However, things began to change in the late 2010s. Our economy slowed, the inequality gap widened, and the black youth became increasingly radicalized. Any black South African associated with the traditionally white party like the DA was viewed as a sellout or a clever black. Not only this, but several more conservative minorities started to look at the DA's policies at the time and realize this wasn't the same party they had signed up for in the late 90s and 2000s. And thus, in the 2019 general election, for the first time in the party's history, the Democratic Alliance's support declined. In the months following the election, we saw the return of Helen Zille to the party's federal council and the exodus of several prominent black leaders, most notably their federal leader Musi Mamani. A few days after Mamani's departure, his chief whip in parliament, John Steenhuisen, was appointed interim party leader, and the party began to backtrack on several policy decisions they had made in recent years, most notably their stance on BEE. This was framed as the DA returning to its true liberal roots after spending years making concessions to try win over ANC voters. Now, many people say that the DA analysed the result of the 2019 election incorrectly, and that they should have viewed their decline in support as just a hiccup and should have continued down the road they were on. But I think the DA analysed the situation perfectly. They looked back at the past 10 years and all the concessions they had made to try and make inroads with the black electorate, and they saw that it was all in vain. You see, publicly the DA claims that a third of their voters are black South Africans, but that is a lie. Even at the height of their electoral success in 2014, black South Africans only accounted for between 10 to 15% of their voters. So not only had the DA failed to make inroads with the black electorate, but they had also isolated several of their coloured Indian and white voters who felt that the party no longer represented their interests. In addition, I think Helen Zille and other leaders at the DA saw that the political scene in South Africa was beginning to fracture. The days of big tent parties with broad appeal were coming to an end. Special interest and ethnic parties were gaining prominence. The DA could no longer afford to be everything to everyone. If they wanted to remain relevant, they were going to have to choose a constituency, and thus the DA once again became a minority-focused party. Now, this isn't to say that the DA has completely abandoned their black voters, or that they don't care at all about gaining new votes within the black African community. There are, of course, several factions within the party who are still very much focused on courting the black electorate. But, for the most part, the DA has accepted that their support in the black community is limited to a small conservative strata. Their current focus is on minority interests, particularly white interests, since they are the bedrock of the party's support base, but they're definitely still going out of their way to appeal to coloured and Indian minorities too. So the DA is not tone deaf, they can read the room, they're just no longer pandering to people who don't vote for them. The people who are outraged every time John Steenhuisen says something controversial, or who have a meltdown about a CGI flag burning, were never going to vote for the DA anyway.